Before you watch this incredible story unfold, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't believe what happened when the airline staff blocked this old man from boarding. ***. There was a time when people trusted authority. When an airline worker said you couldn't board a plane, you accepted it. When security made decisions, you believed they knew what they were doing. But today, something shocking happened at Denver International Airport that would make everyone question everything they thought they knew about following orders. An 87-year-old man named Richard Morrison stood at the gate, holding a small carry-on bag. He had traveled thousands of miles in his life, to business meetings, to family gatherings, to places he'd always dreamed of visiting. But this morning, the flight attendant looked at him and said 3 words that would echo through the entire airport. "I'm sorry, sir. You cannot board." Richard looked confused. He had his ticket. He had his boarding pass. He had his identification. He had followed every rule. But the flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, was shaking her head firmly. "The policy is clear," Sarah said. "You're a safety risk." Richard was a tall man, even at his age. He had kind eyes and gentle hands. He wore a simple blue sweater and clean khaki pants. He carried a book and a photograph of his grandchildren. "I don't understand," Richard said quietly. "What policy? What safety risk?" And then what happened next shocked everyone. Passengers who were already seated in the plane stood up. Flight attendants froze. And one person, a young woman sitting in seat 14C, did something that would change everything. She started to cry, understanding the characters and the conflict. Richard Morrison had been a cardiovascular surgeon for 42 years. He had spent his entire professional life saving people's lives. He had worked through 3 different medical revolutions. When heart surgery went from open-chest operations to minimally invasive procedures, and then to AI-guided robotic surgery. He had trained hundreds of younger doctors. He had published 47 research papers that were cited thousands of times in medical journals around the world. When he retired at 75, his colleagues threw him a party. There were tears. There were testimonials. There were stories about patients he had saved, about lives he had changed. One woman stood up and said, "Dr. Morrison gave me 27 more years with my family." But Richard had also experienced something else in his career. He had experienced discrimination. He had faced it as a young man entering medical school. His family didn't have much money, and some professors didn't think he belonged there. He had faced it as a young doctor. Some older physicians didn't respect that his way of doing things was better, even when the numbers proved it was more effective. But that was all behind him now. Or so he thought. Richard lived in Boston with his wife, Margaret. They had been married for 60 years. They had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. They lived a quiet life. Richard spent his time reading, gardening, and helping at a local community center where he taught young people about health and nutrition. On this particular morning, Richard was flying to Denver to attend his youngest granddaughter's medical school graduation. Her name was Emily, and she was following in his footsteps. She had just finished her first year at the University of Colorado Medical School. Richard was so proud of her that he could barely contain his joy. He had bought a new suit for the occasion. He had prepared a speech that he wanted to give at her graduation celebration. He had even arranged to have flowers delivered to her apartment. Sarah Chen was a flight attendant for the airline, and she had been working that job for 3 years. She was 28 years old and trying to save money to go back to school. She was good at her job. She was efficient and professional. She treated passengers with respect and followed the rules carefully. But this morning, she was following a rule that she didn't fully understand. The airline had recently implemented a new policy called Passenger Safety Assessment. According to this policy, flight crews could deny boarding to any passenger who they felt posed a potential safety risk. The rule was intentionally vague, which gave flight crews a lot of power to make decisions. The policy was created in response to an incident 6 months earlier where an older passenger had suffered a medical emergency during a flight. The man had a heart attack, and while the flight attendants had tried to help, he had died before the plane could make an emergency landing. The airline's lawyers argued that the airline should have screened the passenger more carefully. But the policy had a serious flaw. It gave flight crews permission to discriminate, often without even realizing it. Sarah had reviewed Richard's ticket when he approached the gate. She had looked at him, an elderly man moving slowly, and she had automatically categorized him as a health risk. She had seen his date of birth on his identification, and something clicked in her mind. Old people have medical emergencies. Never mind that Richard was a retired doctor. Never mind that he had better health knowledge than most people on the plane. Never mind that he had just completed a full physical examination the week before, and his doctor had given him a clean bill of health. Never mind that hundreds of elderly people flew every single day without incident. Sarah had made a split-second judgment, and she was sticking to it. "Sir," Sarah said firmly, "according to airline policy, we reserve the right to deny boarding to any passenger we feel poses a health or safety risk. I have assessed you and determined that your age and general appearance suggest you might have a medical emergency during this flight." Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. He tried to argue with her. He tried to explain that he was a doctor. He tried to show her his doctor's report, which he had in his bag just in case. But Sarah wasn't listening. "The policy is final," Sarah said. "You can call the airline's customer service line, or you can rebook on a different flight." Richard felt his heart sink. He was going to miss his granddaughter's graduation celebration. He was going to disappoint Emily. He was going to have to explain to his family why the airline had rejected him based on nothing more than his age. He started to turn away, accepting this unfair situation the way that older people often do, with quiet resignation. But then something unexpected happened. A young woman stood up from her seat inside the gate area. Her name was Jennifer, and she was 24 years old. She was a first-year law student, heading to Denver for a summer internship. She had been watching the interaction between Richard and Sarah, and something about it had bothered her immediately. "Excuse me," Jennifer said, raising her hand. "I'm sorry, but I have to say something. This isn't right." Sarah turned to Jennifer with irritation. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to sit back down. This is not your concern." "Actually," Jennifer said, her voice steady, "I think it is my concern, and I think it's everyone's concern. You're denying boarding to this gentleman based solely on his age. That's age discrimination, which is illegal under federal transportation law." Sarah's face turned red. "I'm not discriminating based on age. I'm making a safety assessment." "But your assessment is based on age," Jennifer pressed. "You wouldn't make that same assessment of a 60-year-old man or a 50-year-old man. You're making it because he's 87. That's discrimination." The other passengers in the gate area had started to pay attention. People were looking up from their phones. Parents were explaining to their children what was happening. An older man sitting near Jennifer stood up. "The girl's right," he said. "I'm 79 years old, and I'm on this flight. How come this man can't board?" Sarah looked uncomfortable. She radioed for her supervisor. The supervisor, a man named Tom who had been working for the airline for 25 years, came down to the gate. He listened to Sarah's explanation and nodded like he understood. But when he looked at Richard, something shifted in his expression. Tom was 62 years old. He had been thinking about retirement for the past 5 years. And seeing Richard standing there, being treated with such disrespect, made Tom think about his own future. What if he got older? What if he traveled one day and someone treated him like this? "Can I see the policy?" Tom asked Sarah. Sarah pulled out a printed copy of the airline's new passenger safety assessment policy. Tom read through it carefully. Then he turned to Sarah and said something that surprised everyone. "Sarah, I think you made a mistake here. This policy gives us the right to assess passenger safety, but it doesn't give us the right to discriminate based on age. If Mr. Morrison can provide medical documentation that he's fit to fly, then we have to accept him. Otherwise, we're opening the airline up to a serious lawsuit." Sarah's face went pale. She hadn't considered this angle. "But sir," she said to Tom, "what if he has a medical emergency?" Tom looked at Richard. "Sir, are you a doctor?" "I was a cardiovascular surgeon," Richard said quietly, "for 42 years. Tom's eyebrows went up. "Do you have any medical documentation?" Richard pulled out the letter from his doctor. It stated that Richard Morrison was in excellent health for his age. His blood pressure was normal. His heart was strong. His oxygen levels were perfect. He had been cleared to travel without restrictions. Tom read the letter carefully. Then he turned back to Sarah. "I'm going to override your decision. Mr. Morrison is cleared to board." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but Tom's expression made it clear that the decision was final. The deep conflict and relatable problems. Richard felt a wave of relief. He was going to make his flight. He was going to see Emily graduate. He was going to be there for his family. But as he moved toward the gate to board, something unexpected happened. The other passengers stood up and started to clap. Richard looked around in shock. People were actually clapping for him. An older woman wiped away tears. A man nodded at Richard with respect. Jennifer, the law student, smiled at him. "Welcome aboard," she said. Richard boarded the plane in a daze. He found his seat, 12B, and settled in. He was still shaken by what had happened, but he was grateful that Tom and Jennifer had stood up for him. The plane filled up with passengers. Most people didn't know what had happened at the gate. They just went through the usual pre-flight routine, finding their seats, stowing their luggage, turning off their phones. But the people who had witnessed the incident in the gate area weren't going to let this go quietly. The young woman who had cried when Richard was almost blocked from boarding, the one in seat 14C, had gotten on the plane after everyone else was settled. Her name was Maria, and she had a very specific reason for her emotional reaction. Maria was 85 years old. She was traveling to Denver to say goodbye to her sister, who was dying of cancer. She had been with her sister through every moment of her illness. She had been at every doctor's appointment. She had held her sister's hand through the chemotherapy treatments. And now, with only weeks left, Maria's sister had asked her to come. But Maria had been terrified of flying. She hadn't flown in 15 years. She had anxiety about traveling, about being too old to handle the physical demands of air travel. It had taken her a month of courage building to actually book this ticket. She had spent countless nights lying awake, wondering if she was making a mistake. Then, when she was about to board, she had witnessed what happened to Richard. She had seen an older person being rejected by the system simply because of their age. And in that moment, all of Maria's fears had crystallized into one terrifying realization. The world had decided that old people didn't belong. Old people were problems. Old people were risks. She had cried because she understood what Richard was experiencing. She had cried because she felt invisible and unwanted. She had cried because she was afraid that this was the world she was going to die in. But then something even more powerful had happened. She had watched younger people, people like Jennifer and Tom, stand up and say that this was wrong. She had watched them defend not just Richard, but in a way, defend all old people. They had defended the idea that age doesn't define your worth or your right to be treated with dignity. That had changed something in Maria. Now, as the plane settled in and the captain came on the intercom to welcome everyone aboard, Maria felt different. She felt like she belonged. She felt like people cared. The flight from Denver to Boston was about 4.5 hours. It was a routine flight. The weather was good. The plane took off smoothly. People started to settle in, pulling out their books, their laptops, their earbuds. Richard sat in his window seat, looking out at the sky below him. He thought about Emily. He thought about her achievement. He thought about how proud he was of her. Then, about an hour into the flight, something unexpected happened. Richard started to feel pressure in his chest. At first, he thought it was just heartburn. He had eaten a quick breakfast before coming to the airport. Maybe it was sitting down for a while. He shifted in his seat. He tried to relax. But the pressure got worse. Richard knew his body. He knew what was normal and what wasn't. And this pressure in his chest was not normal. This felt like something was wrong. He was having a heart attack. Richard's initial reaction was to stay calm. He took several deep breaths. He loosened his seatbelt. He closed his eyes and tried to center himself. He had been in medical emergencies before. He had been the person in control, making the decisions. Now he was the patient. He reached up and pushed the call button. A flight attendant named Michael appeared. Michael was 32 years old and had been working for the airline for 7 years. He was well trained in emergency procedures. "How can I help you, sir?" Michael asked. "I think I'm having a heart attack," Richard said calmly. "I need oxygen, and I need to get to a doctor as quickly as possible." Michael's face went pale. A heart attack during a flight. This was the kind of emergency every flight attendant dreaded. He immediately radioed the cockpit. "Captain, we have a medical emergency in the main cabin. Passenger reporting possible cardiac event." The captain's voice came back. "Understood. We're checking our manifest for medical personnel. Do we have a doctor on board?" Michael looked at Richard. "Sir, are you able to tell me your name?" "Richard Morrison. And yes, I'm a doctor. I'm a cardiovascular surgeon. But I'm also a patient right now." Michael relayed this information to the cockpit. There was a pause. Then the captain's voice came back. "Let me put this on the cabin intercom." The captain's voice filled the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency. We're looking for any medical personnel on board who can assist. If you're a doctor, nurse, EMT, or any other medical professional, please press your call button immediately. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, one button after another lit up. 3 doctors stood up. 2 nurses. An EMT. A physician's assistant. One of those doctors was a young woman in the back of the plane. She had been reading a medical journal, studying for her boards. Her name was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and she was a cardiologist. She had spent the last 10 years specializing in exactly the kind of emergency that was happening right now. Dr. Mitchell rushed forward. She introduced herself to Richard and began assessing him. "Chest pain?" she asked. "Yes." "Radiating to my left arm," Richard said. "Shortness of breath?" "Yes." "EKG symptoms?" "I can feel the irregularity in my heartbeat." Dr. Mitchell looked at another doctor who had come forward, an older man named Dr. James Chun, who was a general internist. "I think he's right," Dr. Chun said. "We need to get this plane to the nearest airport with a cardiac care facility immediately." The captain was already working on this. "We're diverting to Kansas City International. That's the nearest facility with a full cardiac hospital. We'll be on the ground in 45 minutes. What happened next was extraordinary. The entire plane shifted into emergency mode. The other medical professionals set up a makeshift medical station around Richard's seat. They got oxygen from the plane's emergency kit. They monitored his vitals constantly. They asked Richard detailed questions about his symptoms, his medical history, his medications. And through it all, Richard remained calm. He was a doctor helping other doctors help him. It was surreal and comforting at the same time. But the most powerful thing that happened was what the passengers did. Everyone on that plane understood that Richard was sick. Everyone understood that the next 45 minutes could be the difference between life and death. And so they gave him something more precious than they probably realized. They gave him their attention, their care, their prayers. People who had been angry about being stuck on a delayed flight suddenly didn't care about the delay. Parents explained to their children that sometimes people need help, and that's okay. Religious people of all faiths prayed quietly in their seats. Maria, sitting in 14C, prayed harder than she had prayed in years. She prayed for Richard, this stranger who had stood up for her dignity just an hour earlier by being denied boarding and then welcomed aboard. She prayed that he would live. Jennifer, the law student, sat very still and thought about what she had done at the gate. She had stood up for what she believed was right. And now, the man she had defended was in the fight of his life. The flight attendants were incredible. Michael and the other flight attendants circulated through the plane, making sure everyone was okay, updating them on the situation when they could. "The captain says we're making good time," one flight attendant announced. "We're expecting to land in about 35 minutes. 40 minutes later, the plane's tires touched the runway at Kansas City International Airport. An ambulance was waiting on the tarmac. As soon as the plane came to a stop, the emergency personnel rushed aboard. They had a stretcher ready. They had equipment. They had a team of paramedics and ER doctors ready to take over Richard's care. Dr. Mitchell gave them a quick report. Possible acute myocardial infarction. Onset approximately 1 hour ago. Vitals stable but irregular heartbeat. He's conscious and cooperative. The paramedics transferred Richard to the stretcher carefully. As they rolled him off the plane, Richard looked back at the passengers watching from their seats. "Thank you," he said quietly. "All of you. Thank you." The moment of justice and transformation. Richard survived. The emergency room doctors at Kansas City's Cardinal Glennon Hospital ran all the tests. They found that Richard had indeed suffered a heart attack, what's called a widowmaker because of where the blockage occurred. He had been experiencing the classic symptoms, and he had gotten help at exactly the right moment. The cardiologists determined that Richard needed emergency surgery. They cleared a surgical suite and brought him in. For 3 hours, they worked to restore blood flow to his damaged heart. When Richard woke up in the recovery room, his daughter was there holding his hand. She had gotten a call from the airline about what had happened. She had immediately driven to Kansas City from St. Louis. "You scared me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I scared myself," Richard said weakly. "But if I hadn't gotten on that plane, I probably would have been alone when it happened. I probably would have died." Richard spent 5 days in the hospital. During that time, he received visitor after visitor. Dr. Sarah Mitchell came by to check on him. She brought flowers and a card signed by the medical professionals who had helped him on the plane. Jennifer, the law student, came by. She had changed her flight and stayed in Kansas City for an extra day specifically to visit him. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," she said. You scared all of us. I'm grateful for what you did, Richard said. At the gate, you stood up for what was right. And I think that moment when you defended me and when people stood up and clapped, I think that moment saved my life. What do you mean? Jennifer asked. I mean that when I got on that plane, I felt like I was part of a community, Richard said. I felt like these people cared about me. And when I had the heart attack, I had the courage to ask for help immediately, instead of trying to hide it or minimize it. That courage, that comfort, that feeling of belonging, that came from what happened at the gate. You reminded everyone, including me, that we matter, that we belong. Even Maria came by. She was visiting her sister in the same hospital, just a few floors up. She had heard that Richard was recovering. I wanted to thank you, Maria said. For what? Richard asked. You're the one who was going through something difficult. You're the one who had to be brave. No, Maria said. You gave me something. When they tried to block you from boarding, you could have just accepted it quietly. But instead, you let other people stand up for you. You let us feel like we were part of something important. And then, when you had the heart attack, you became the hero of that story. You reminded all of us that life is fragile, but it's also precious. You reminded all of us that we need to help each other. When Richard was released from the hospital, he was told that he needed to take it easy for the next few weeks. He wouldn't be able to travel back to Boston for a while. But Emily came to see him. She drove from Denver to Kansas City to be with her grandfather. They sat together in the hospital's garden, and Richard told her everything. About being blocked from boarding, about Jennifer defending him, about the heart attack, about the extraordinary doctors and flight attendants who had helped him. Grandpa, Emily said, you were supposed to come to Denver to celebrate my graduation. I know, sweetheart, Richard said. And I'm sorry I missed it. But you didn't miss anything important, Emily said. You were celebrating something bigger. You were celebrating the goodness in people. And that's a lesson I'm going to remember for my entire career as a doctor. 2 months later, when Richard had recovered enough to travel, he and his wife Margaret flew back to Boston. The airlines wanted to make a statement about the incident. They called it a clarification of their policy. An airline executive held a press conference. We have reviewed the incident that occurred on Flight 247 from Denver to Boston, the executive said. We have determined that our passenger safety assessment policy, as it was implemented, was flawed. Age is not a valid criterion for assessing passenger safety. We are revising our policy to explicitly prohibit age-based discrimination. We have also terminated the flight attendant who made the discriminatory decision and have retrained all of our personnel on anti-discrimination laws and procedures. The executive also announced that the airline would be making a substantial donation to a cardiac research fund in Richard's name. And they were creating a new award for exceptional customer service in honor of the employees who had stepped in to help. Tom, the supervisor who had overridden the policy, and Michael and the other flight attendants who had responded so professionally to the medical emergency. The incident made national news. Articles were written about age discrimination in the airline industry. Lawyers started filing lawsuits on behalf of other people who had been discriminated against. Medical schools started discussing the incident in their ethics classes. But more importantly, the incident sparked a conversation about how we treat older people in society. Jennifer, who had spoken up at the gate, was offered a job by a major civil rights law firm. They wanted her to work on cases involving age discrimination in transportation and employment. She accepted, and her very first case was helping to establish new legal precedent around airline policies. Tom, the supervisor who had overridden Sarah's decision, was promoted to regional director. He implemented new training procedures that emphasized the legal and ethical problems with age-based discrimination. He became an advocate within his company for changing policies that treated older people as problems instead of as valued customers and members of society. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the cardiologist who had helped Richard on the plane, was invited to give a talk at a medical conference about emergency response in unusual situations. She talked about how Richard's medical knowledge had helped him communicate his symptoms clearly, and how the presence of multiple medical professionals on the plane had been crucial to his survival. But the most important transformation might have been what happened to Sarah, the young flight attendant who had initially blocked Richard from boarding. After she was fired, Sarah went through a period of serious soul-searching. She realized that she had made a discriminatory decision, and that decision could have killed a man. She could have been responsible for the death of a cardiovascular surgeon who had spent his entire life saving lives. Sarah decided to go back to school. She entered a program to become a healthcare advocate. Her goal became to work for organizations that fight against age discrimination and other forms of discrimination in healthcare and transportation. 3 years later, Sarah was working for a nonprofit that helps older people navigate healthcare systems. She told people about what she had learned from the incident. "I made a terrible mistake that day. I made an assumption about someone based on their age, and that assumption could have had tragic consequences. But I learned something important, that we are all capable of being better. We're all capable of recognizing our prejudices and working to overcome them." The lasting impact and life lesson. The story of Richard Morrison and Flight 247 became known as a turning point in how airlines and other institutions approached age discrimination. It became a case study in medical schools, law schools, and business schools. But the deepest impact was something more personal and more universal. The story taught us that age is not a measure of a person's value or their capacity to contribute to society. Richard had been denied boarding because of his age. But it was his medical knowledge and his calm demeanor during a medical emergency that very well saved his own life. It was the older passengers on the plane who understood, perhaps better than younger passengers, the fragility of life and the importance of helping each other. It was Maria, an 85-year-old woman afraid of flying, who gained courage from witnessing someone defend another older person's dignity. The story also taught us about the power of speaking up. Jennifer, a young woman on the way to an internship, could have stayed silent. She could have minded her own business. But she spoke up because she recognized that what was happening was wrong. That one act of courage set in motion a series of events that changed laws, policies, and people's hearts. Richard often said in interviews after the incident, "I learned something on that plane. I learned that the world is better than I sometimes think it is. I learned that there are people, young and old, who will stand up for what's right. I learned that community is real. I learned that we need each other." The airline industry did change. Within 2 years, most major airlines had revised their policies to explicitly protect older passengers from age-based discrimination. Some airlines went further, creating special programs to help older and disabled travelers. One airline even created a scholarship program for young people studying medicine or healthcare, with preference given to applicants who had demonstrated compassion and ethics in their lives. Emily, Richard's granddaughter, did graduate from medical school. At her graduation ceremony, she gave a speech about her grandfather and about what she had learned from his experience. "When I was trying to decide whether to become a doctor," Emily said, "my grandfather had a heart attack on a plane. It sounds strange to say this, but that event confirmed my decision. Because I realized that medicine isn't just about the science. It's about recognizing the dignity and value of every person, regardless of their age or appearance or background. It's about having the courage to help, even when it's difficult. It's about remembering that we're all in this together." The medical professionals who had helped on the flight became friends. Dr. Sarah Mitchell and Richard started meeting for coffee when they were both in their respective cities. They talked about medicine, about aging, about the importance of compassion in healthcare. They became mentors to each other in different ways. Maria, the woman who had been traveling to say goodbye to her sister, did make it to Denver. She spent those final weeks with her sister, and when her sister died, she was there holding her hand. She later said that the experience with Richard on the plane had given her the strength to be fully present during those final days. She had stopped being afraid of not belonging. She had stopped being afraid of being old. Tom, the supervisor, looked back on that moment at the gate as a turning point in his career. He realized that his job wasn't just to follow rules and maximize efficiency. His job was to help people, to make good decisions, to treat everyone with dignity. The story of Richard Morrison and Flight 247 reminds us of something fundamental about being human. We have a responsibility to each other. We have a responsibility to recognize injustice and speak up against it. We have a responsibility to help those in need. We have a responsibility to see the value in every person, regardless of their age, appearance, or circumstances. ***. The most powerful lesson from this story might be this. The world doesn't change when powerful people decide to change it. The world changes when ordinary people have the courage to stand up and say, "This is wrong," and when other ordinary people have the compassion to listen and to help. Richard learned that his life still had value and meaning, even in retirement. Jennifer learned that speaking up matters, even when it's uncomfortable. Tom learned that following your conscience is more important than following the rules. The passengers on that plane learned that they were capable of being a community, even strangers on an airplane. And Sarah, the flight attendant, learned that it's never too late to acknowledge a mistake and to change. In the end, the incident on Flight 247 was not really about a heart attack on a plane. It was about something much deeper. It was about whether we believe that every person deserves to be treated with dignity. It was about whether we believe that age doesn't diminish value. It was about whether we believe that we have a responsibility to stand up for what's right. And when we look at what actually happened, when we see that an 87-year-old man not only survived a heart attack, but also became the catalyst for changing airline policies, when we see that a young law student's moment of courage led to legal precedent, when we see that a flight attendant who made a mistake became an advocate for change, we understand that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that show us who we can become when we choose compassion over apathy, justice over convenience, and each other over ourselves. Loudspeaker final call to action. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to see more stories about real people doing extraordinary things. Stories about courage, standing up for what's right, and the power of community to change lives. Comment below and tell us, have you ever witnessed age discrimination? Have you ever spoken up against injustice when you could have stayed silent? Have you ever received help from an unexpected source? We'd love to hear your stories. ***. The real moral of this story is simple. Every person deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their age. And when we have the courage to defend that principle, when we speak up, when we help, when we stand together, we don't just change one person's life. We change the world. If you know someone who is older and who deserves to be treated better, share this story with them. Let them know that they matter. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Reminding each other that we all matter. ***. End of story. Approximately 4,000 words.